Okay, so like to introduce Cathlene, who's a PhD candidate in the Department of Religious Studies at UCT. She's researching the impact of transnational Tijani Sufi movements on the secular nationalist politics of the Republic of Turkey. So Cathlene will be providing some closing commentary, and then we'll move on to our next panelist. Thank you.
In preparation for this symposium, I pored over issues of Dabiq and Rumiyah because I wanted to give a direct response to specific claims made by ISIS against the global Muslim community. I've come to realize after today, especially the potentially suspicious appearance of this, especially now that we've learned about those FBI undercover operations to create terrorist plots for the purpose of entrapment. I initially wanted to take this approach because I thought it would be a good way to address the problem of ISIS head on. I wanted to do this instead of trying to sidestep the problem of ISIS by making idealist or apologist suggestions like, if we ignore them, they'll go away, or they don't represent Islam. As I perused their very glitzy, professionally edited English language publications that feature articles from individuals with a detailed, idiosyncratic, and even impressive knowledge of the Quran, of Hadith, of fiqh, I began to realize that trying to articulate a direct response to their claims, even within the context of a single article, would be difficult. For one thing, trying to find reason or prudence in any kind of extreme ideology, as we've found today, as noted by several of our speakers today, will always be a task fraught with the pitfalls of attempting to find balance and hypocrisy in the irrational. Maulana Rawat made a similar observation this afternoon when he said that when ISIS first emerged, they sent the ulama back to the books to try and make sense of these extremist theology, their extremist theology. What's more, it quickly became evident upon studying ISIS's propaganda that simply rejecting them as outside the fold of Islam on the grounds that their interpretation of Islam is too radical, too violent, it's just not sufficient. Much to my relief, Imam Omar confirmed this morning when he noted that acknowledging extremism within Islam does not necessarily undermine the Islam of others. So I now feel that this approach doesn't actually sound so ridiculous. Following from this, it seems more effective to go ahead and begin to discredit ISIS from within the context of Islam. In other words, it's too easy to simply write them off, as I mentioned, as not true Muslims, as true as this might be to all of us. Of course, nobody is insinuating that the ideology of ISIS, or their claims of Khilafah, or their perverted justification of their actions via detailed knowledge of Islam are in any way acceptable. Rather, it's perfectly obvious that the behavior of ISIS, in spite of their ability to invoke precise and even subtle knowledge about Islam, is very clearly in flagrant violation of possibly the most quintessential dimensions of Islam that we've mentioned today, such as justice, education, and the sanctity of human life. One of the regular features of Dabiq and now Rumiyah is a report on ISIS's ongoing operations. Each monthly report focuses on a different region and details how many vehicles and buildings were destroyed, the amount of prisoners taken, and finally, the official tally of how many kuffar, or Christian crusaders, or mutaddin, have been wounded and or killed. Often these reports are followed by articles which discuss particular attacks. For instance, the 6th issue of Rumiyah includes an article which discusses the attack on a nightclub in Istanbul on December 31st of 2016, in which 39 people were killed. The article is titled, "Shedding Light on the Blessed Operation in Istanbul." The article begins by directly addressing this issue about the sanctity of life, and I quote, "Every act of the mujahideen that harms the mushrikeen, the people of kufr, and the deviants come out with their tongues and pens to alter the details and flip the truth. Their aim is to defame and vilify the muwahideen, showing them as corrupt sinners who care nothing for the sanctity of life or religion." End quote. The article goes on to justify in elaborate terms who are the true criminals in this situation and ones like it, and I'll give you a hint, it's not ISIS. Unsurprisingly, the article does not go on to expound on their initial allusion to the idea that ISIS nurtures any care for the sanctity of life. Various verses from the Quran are invoked to help explain their reasoning and provide what at first may appear to be unquestionable justifications for the Istanbul attack. One such justification cites Al-Baqarah 217, part of which indicates that the sin of fitna is greater than killing. The article goes on to emphasize the gravity of committing fitna, which seems to imply that killing is a justifiable action when this sin is evident. Ultimately, the purpose of the article does not appear to be a discussion of the variations in gravity of sin. However, plenty of attention is paid to the sins and immorality of the patrons of the nightclub and highlights these sins of the clubbers as further justification for killing them. The point I want to make is the reasoning that sanctification can be reached by committing a lesser sin, or perceived to be a lesser sin, especially one which is extensively condemned throughout the Quran, bears much resemblance to the reasoning of the first Khawarij. Sheikh Hendricks also noted the resemblance of ISIS to Khawarij this morning. As many of you may know, the earliest group that can be considered Khawarij rejected Ali's leadership and killed him after he refused to engage in combat to decide the succession of the caliphate. In response to their irrational claims, Ali's cousin Ibn Abbas was among the first of many renowned Muslim scholars throughout the history of Islam to cite the grave theological errors in the Quranic interpretations of Khawarij and ultimately to condemn them. We may be able to understand ISIS's failure to adopt an allegorical approach to the sin of fitna as an equivalent kind of grave theological error. In other words, ISIS's literal interpretation of the verse of the sin of fitna deliberately subverts the severity of killing in order to justify their actions. The verse does not say that killing people is fine in relation to how terrible fitna is. As Ambassador Rasul noted this morning, interpreting the Quran is about finding the best meaning, not necessarily standing with the first conclusion reached or even being satisfied with a static interpretation. In a similar vein, Sheikh Hendricks noted the metaphorical quality of Arabic and the care that should also be taken when dealing with literalist interpretations of such a language. The demarcation of ISIS as Khawarij will not make them dissolve, nor is it likely to impact their ability to generate literalist theological justifications for their violent actions. Nevertheless, what I suggest is that we make a concerted effort to respond to ISIS directly, instead of ambivalently or even apologetically. I believe we can do this by drawing attention to the depraved manner in which they claim legitimacy and provide justification for their actions. We must endeavor to eclipse the global focus on the idea that ISIS bears any realistic validity within the Muslim community. We can capitalize on the fact that there is a definitive precedent in the ability of the Muslim community to distance itself from Khawarij groups and propagate Islam in a sustainable way. History has shown us, and indeed ISIS has repeatedly proved this through their own actions, that their strategy for promulgation of Islam is simply not sustainable. There is no Wasatiyyah, no middlemost method to their perverted interpretations. In this way, it's not even so much about the fact that they aren't true Muslims or even that their claims are actually just invalid. It's about the fact that their approach is completely unsustainable. To me, ISIS's blatant violation of the sanctity of human life is proof enough that this is the case. In light of this, what we can do is be sustainable. As Professor Arnold noted, let's rather spend time looking at and working on what makes for a successful Muslim community. And I would just like to end by noting that the Rumiyah article justifying the attack on the Reina Club in Istanbul concludes by citing verse 2 from Al-Ma'idah, which says, "Assist one another upon duty and piety, and do not assist one another upon sin and transgression." Ironically for ISIS, this verse actually provides us with an ideal opportunity to begin responding to them directly. And also to practice sustainability. We do not assist you upon your sins and transgressions.
Thank you, Cathlene. Our second commentator is Shafiq Morton, who is an award-winning Cape Town-based photojournalist, editor, surfer, and a presenter on the drive time slot at Voice of the Cape.
Assalamu alaikum. And being the second last speaker, I think my brief is to be very brief. I'm just going to cherry pick one or two issues and how I, in my own way, have understood them. This whole symposium surrounding itself with the idea of Wasatiyyah and how do we understand and how do we deal with ISIS. I think what was profound was the first Quranic recitation very early this morning, where in English it says, indeed Allah is to the people kind and merciful. And the words that the Quran uses there are Ra'uf ar-Rahim, which is one of the attributes of Allah. So this is something that I think we should always remember. A profound point that came out in the morning indirectly is that the majority of Muslims are not from the Middle East. So the majority does not contribute to the majority of extremists. I think we have to remember this. And the research of Raisa Kachalia from the ISS proves this point, that where you have societies that are inherently unstable, for example, such as those in North Africa and some of the Arab countries, we are going to have attendant social problems, manifestations of frustration, and obviously of extremism being the extension of that. I think what was very important was Sheikh Siraj Hendricks and Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool wrestling with the idea of Wasatiyyah. And what came out of it, apart from the fact that Sheikh Siraj Hendricks said he hated Ibn al-Waqt, was the fact that he said that Wasatiyyah is not a linear perspective. He used the idea of a circle, and I will extrapolate to say that I understand we stay in the middle of the circle, but it's a dynamic structure. And out of this came Naim Jeenah's idea that Wasatiyyah doesn't mean sleeping in the middle of the circle and watching the stars or looking at our navel. It actually means that we have to be proactive. So that, to me at least, is what I will take away from you today in my understanding of Wasatiyyah. I think sometimes we misunderstand who exactly we are. In fact, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murat, a famous English sheikh, once said that Wasatiyyah was actually the radical middle way. So there's some food for thought on that. The other talk that sort of struck a lot of notes with me, being a journalist, was the address by Khadija Patel, where she said, in the media, and of course you can blame all of ISIS's problems on us because we got it wrong, is that we have a crisis of relevance. And this is a very, very serious crisis in the media industry. And it's not a question of who owns the media. Is it the Zionists? Is it Persco, Narspes, whoever? The issue is, on the ground, the reality that we face is that newsrooms have become junior. There are no longer any senior journalists. People like Shafiq Morton, I'm a living dinosaur. Tomorrow I'm gone. And filling my space, as it were, are junior journalists, reflecting the problems that we have, and that is stories are written, and particularly in terms of ISIS, no context whatsoever. We don't understand the history, we don't understand the geopolitics, and you have people in the industry writing these stories with no idea of what they're actually doing, and I'm being totally honest about it. So this is one of the other challenges, and I think it's a challenge that sometimes gets overlooked a little bit, and that is the fact that in the media, as much as Islam has a crisis, as much as the world has a crisis, in the media we've got our own crisis to deal with. Another point that I found quite interesting, having reverted to Islam about 100 years ago, when they were building the castle, was the fact that reverts are vulnerable. And I can remember, I was a revert at the time of the anti-apartheid struggle, and I was sucked into that vortex, as it were. And when I look back at some of the things that we did or were planning to do, alhamdulillah, I'm still here today. Because we were doing things and claiming they were jihad, when I look back now, they weren't jihad, they were just plain youthful stupidity, actually. So there's a lot to be said in that, and it also ties back to the point that Sheikh Siraj Hendricks made, that education is just so important. And education of young people is the most important thing of all. Now, it's a big question, so there isn't much time, so I can just deal with generalities. But as part of understanding ISIS, as part of dealing of extremism, we need to go back to our madrasas. What sort of education are we offering young people when they start out in the world? Alif, ba, ta, tha, off by heart, hit them over the hands. If they get ba before tha or tha before ba or something, that's not going to do it. I think we are going to have to start educating our young people in terms of who are they in the world, what is their identity, where do we come from, and where are we going to. If we don't do that, I'm afraid to say we are just going to spawn another generation of extremists. I'm going to leave it there. There are lots of things that I could say. I made lots of notes like a very good journalist. My final point is that I think that we need to remember that whilst the seeds of ISIS are indeed in theology, and my ideal is not the Caliphate, because I feel in South Africa we have a constitution and a democracy that does protect our rights. And as somebody who's traveled through the worst parts of the Muslim world, I've been shot at, spat at, bombed. I've been called a kafir, I've been called a Zionist, I've been called an American, a Turk, all sorts of things. But, right. But at the end of the day, we have to understand that as much as ISIS is a question of theology, it's also a question of geopolitics. And how do we solve the geopolitical question? I don't have the answers to that, but I think in our very humble way, at home in South Africa, starting from the castle, maybe some self-introspection about how do we deal with this ISIS problem. I think we have all the tools here in South Africa. We have a government that has a very reasonable approach to the whole problem. A lot of people haven't been impressed by the idea that government doesn't throw people away in jail and the key, but I do think that trying to understand what the problem is and not throwing people in jail may be part of the solution. And I think in South Africa we do actually have some answers. We just need to find them and present them to the rest of the world. Thank you very much. Shukran.
Shafiq, I wrote an entire academic book chapter explaining why our youthful stupidity was jihad, and you just deflated it. I'm going to try and be as even quicker than Shafiq. I think one of the things that comes out of today is the need for an understanding about the wideness and broadness of Islam and what Islam is, and the manner in which Islam is able to accommodate a wide spectrum of understandings and views. This, of course, is the complete antithesis of fundamentalism, which believes that there is only one truth and one way. And I think that this is an important idea. The idea also that no one Muslim person or one Muslim group has a monopoly on the meaning of what is Islam. But also that Muslims as a whole do not have a monopoly on extremism. I think this has been clear from today as well. What we really need to do as a Muslim community, I think, is work towards ending the denialism that plagues us. We have to take ownership of our problems. And this is a general comment, but certainly in the context of today. ISIS is our problem. It doesn't go away if we blame the media. It doesn't go away if we blame the Jews. In fact, doing that only abdicates us of responsibility, number one, and number two, makes it impossible to face the challenge that it is. And this goes for all the challenges that exist within our community. If we don't take ownership, if we insist on denialism, we're not going to confront the challenges and not overcome them. And so too, Muhammad, we should take ownership of the ideology that is behind ISIS. I think that you're absolutely correct. That much of what ISIS argues as being true Islam, if you want to call it that, is able to be argued because there are those options in our fiqh. It's there. Even when they burnt that Jordanian pilot, they had a good argument for it, in my opinion. I don't agree with the argument, but it's a good argument for why they did it and why, according to the Sharia, they argued, it is acceptable. The point is then, let's take ownership for the backwardness that does exist in our fiqh, the problems that do exist in our fiqh, and say that these exist and we need to confront them, we need to face them, and we need to change them if they need to be changed. Whether that is talking about a big issue like the Caliphate, or others mentioned issues around slavery, women, all of these things. These exist. People like Baghdadi and his ilk are able to make the arguments because it's there. And frankly, when they say, as Andrea, as Musaji said in his letter, it's in your books, because it is in your books. Admit that it's in our books and say, do we accept these books? Do we accept everything that's in these books, or do we need to rethink what's in these books? And if that's the only thing that we leave here today with, then I think that we've gotten somewhere. Let me make one final point before ending, and that is that Shafiq alluded to it as well, the position of the South African government on this issue. I want to also say that the position that the South African government has taken is, and people that know me in this room know that I'm not someone to usually compliment the government, but it is, I think, is the right position tactically. But being that, it also comes under tremendous amount of pressure because of that position. That pressure comes from the Americans, that pressure comes from the Israelis, that pressure comes from political parties in South Africa, that pressure comes from other foreign governments, and from various civil society organizations within South Africa. I was at a meeting earlier this week where there was a great deal of bemoaning that the South African government refuses to take on these notions of preventing violent extremism and countering violent extremism. And how should we convince them that this is the way to go? And how should these group of NGOs play a kind of a role to link the government with the community? Talking about, of course, the Muslim community. Well, I said very irritatingly that neither the Muslim community nor the South African government wants us NGOs to play this role, because they both talk to each other quite well without our assistance. But there's all of these actors that want to play this role to force a particular discourse, and more importantly, a particular strategy around dealing with these kinds of issues onto the South African government. I think that that's something that we need to be cognizant of. Finally, let me say that it has been an absolute pleasure working with Shafiq San and Imam Rashid Omar and Sister Nafisa Masnouna and others in putting this together. It was a great opportunity for us to partner with IPSA, although I confess that at AMEC we were the minority partner, we did less of the work, but nevertheless it was a great honor. I hope that this partnership we can build on, and so I should, Sheikh, if I can say on your behalf as well, since you seem quite comfortable there and you're not going to come forward, it seems, that on behalf of IPSA and on behalf of the Afro-Middle East Center, to thank all of you, particularly those of you who tortured yourself enough to stay until this point, and all of those who attended today, and particularly as well all of the speakers, whether I agreed with everyone or not, all of the speakers for inputs that I think helped this conversation move forward. Jazakumullah. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much.